Welcome to the debut of my brand new intro. Welcome, Talking Time About Caffeine, the podcast where we talk, we do caffeine stuff, and we talk some more about stuff.
Is my
Now,
Monster Energy drink sufficient to qualify for caffeine stuff?
eh, sure.
Sweet.
Uh, this had been pushed back a week because of holiday seasons. It's pushed back to this time because of holiday workings.
Yes.
But yes, that's about it.
And today, hopefully, we're going to do the brand new debut of Google SlideShare on StreamYard.
Yeah, they shifted some stuff around. It doesn't look that different, but they changed where theming options are selectable. So y'all gonna have to deal with that default white theme instead of my fancy colors. Sorry about that.
Oh.
Aside from that, yeah, we're gonna be talking about the Permian period today.
Now, spoiler alert, it does not have a happy ending.
No, it has in fact, in my presentation, I talk about it has a series of very sad endings that just hit one after the other.
Kick them while they're down.
That's literally what nature did. Yes. Okay.
Right. So, like always, we shall start with the land that the creatures walked on.
Let's go. All right. So I'm gonna share my screen here.
Achoo.
Okay. Is that visible to everybody?
No.
No.
I'm
Okay.
saying-
I did something.
Oh, wait.
Not-
Yes, it is.
Sweet.
I hit
Nice.
the button.
Nice. Sweet. Okay. So, we're talking about Permian geology today. So, as always, what the heck is the Permian period? Well, the Permian period is spans about 47 million years, and it's roughly between the Carboniferous period and the Triassic. Spans between about 289 million years ago to 251.9, somewhere around there. It is, fun fact, the last period of the Paleozoic. So what you got here on this little stratigraphic chart, you got your Precambrian down here, the Neoproterozoic and all that. And the Permian right here is right beneath the Mesozoic, right before the quote-unquote age of dinosaurs. So this is the last bit of the Paleozoic.
So it's the season 1 finale or season 2 finale. Maybe?
Essentially, yeah, it's a good way to put it. And sorry, the Permian gets its name from the ancient kingdom of Permia, whose territory used to encompass the Ural Mountains. And the Ural Mountains is where much of the early stratigraphy that first identified the Permian was mapped out by geologists. And then subdivisions were named after, like, nearby towns and things like that, or other regional features. Sorry. So let's look at the stratigraphic boundaries. What is the Permian? Well, right here I got a chart of the Permian. You got some interesting data. You got some your global geologic communities like markers. Where do we decide what fossils mark what period? You got your sea level chart for what was the sea level doing at this time. You got your coastal onlap for certain different basins, and then a bunch of chemical data for what defines the Permian. But again, the Permian spans about 251 million years ago. Has a fairly well-defined upper and lower boundary. Certainly the upper boundary is very well-defined. The lower boundary is usually decided at a point all over, like England and Germany. You have these carboniferous coal beds. And then on top of them, you have this channelized erosive contact where there was a lot of erosion and exposure that made this uneven unconformity surface. And then on top of that, you have your first Permian layers, which are these red beds, and they don't have a lot of fossils, but these dolomitic limestones and other things are laying on top of that unconformity. And they're very clear, they're very obvious, and that's where we decided the lower boundary was. And the upper boundary, the depositional environment isn't always unconformable, but you really can't miss it because there's a giant extinction event which we're going to talk about later. But that is what the upper boundary is defined by.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Hey, real fast, we have a question from some guy. I don't know who this is,
sure.
but
What's the question? I can't see it.
Oh, sorry. Some guy named James Downard, I think his name is. Never heard of him before. It says, was the Permian so short because of the geology? Was such a mess the life turnover got measured as a prelude to the New Age?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Was Permian so short because the geology was such a mess that the life turnover got its measured as prelude to New Age?
Yeah, that's a pretty good description of it. It's like you can have 2 or 3 geologic periods that span like upwards of 100 million years or something. But then if the next one comes along and then a massive extinction event just happens like 40 million years in, humans when we come along are going to just say that's a pretty good place to end it. So, yeah, geology was a mess. It was a lot more chaotic, and it's going to be a little bit shorter as a result, depending on how we define things.
Thank you for your question, James. I should get you together with Jackson here. You two could write a book together someday, maybe.
Oh my God. Anyways, but looking at this Permian timescale chart right here, you'll see this is, again, keep in mind, this is all the Permian. You've got the Carboniferous down here, and you've got the Triassic up here, but then you got all these subdivisions, and we're not going to get into every one of these stages. But we are going to talk about the epochs. The stages are mostly
we only have a few. We only have a few. We only have so long. It's not like a 20-hour live stream tonight.
Yeah. For those who are curious, though, the stages are mostly named after like either the people who named them or after like local towns where rocks were described. But then you have the epochs, which we are going to discuss a little bit. So the Permian epochs. So the Permian is generally divided into 3 epochs, which from oldest to youngest are the Silurian, the Guadalupian, and the Lopingian. The Silurian is named after strata exposed on the western slopes of the Ural Mountains, roughly between Russia and Kazakhstan. Guadalupian is likewise named after the Guadalupe Mountains in Texas and New Mexico, where you have extensive marine sequences of Permian age exposed and easy to look at and outcrop. And that was named by George Herbert Gertie in 1902. And then the Lopingian actually is a very complicated naming history. So its name was first introduced in 1923 by Amadeus William Grabow as the Loping series, which was a play on words of Leping, oh God, I can't pronounce that, Jiaxing, China. But later in 1932, it was decided to be a series instead of like a local thing. It was decided to be a global series, including all Permian deposits covering South China, which overlie the Mauco limestone. And then in 1995, a vote by the Subcommission on Permian Stratigraphy of the ICS adopted it as a international chronostratigraphic unit. So that third epoch actually has a fairly recent origin in terms of its global significance, anyways. Yeah, those little subdivisions. Now, the Permian's paleogeography is quite interesting. So during the Permian, most of the Earth's land masses were officially in what we call Pangaea. Now, you also had this microcontinental terrains of Cathasia in the east, but most of it was Pangaea. And Pangaea straddled the equator and extended, as you can see here, it extended to the poles on either side.
And so how long would it take you to drive from one end to the other end?
Oh, God, I couldn't tell you, dude. It depends on the terrain. Also depends on how much fossil fuel you'll have access to, which at this time, skeptical.
Well, most of the coal beds just got formed, didn't they? Like about last million years or so.
Well, what does your car run on? coal, or do you have a magical Tesla factory that's
Well,
giving
I
batteries?
guess it could do the old-fashioned steam engine railroads.
I mean, yeah, that would be cool, but oh god, don't get please don't get me started on trains, Lamont. You don't need to be doing that right now. You want to get me on for an episode on the history of like the North American railroad system? Do that some other time. Anyways, so the arrangement of these continents, however, did extremely influence the ocean currents and the patterns of Earth's oceans at the time. So you had it's not shown here. It's on the other side of the planet, but you had this big, way bigger than the Pacific, uh, Panthalassa, which was literally translates to universal ocean. It's a massive ocean on the other side of the planet. Then you had this somewhat enclosed large ocean called the Paleotethys, which later became the Tethys Sea in a later epoch. Um, and this one pretty much separated what would become Asia and the rest of Gondwana. But this was another like sort of this was kind of like the Atlantic, but like not fully dividing the globe. And then on the other, you had a much bigger Pacific analog. Now, also at the time, the Central Pangaean Mountains, which formed due to the collision of Laurasia and Gondwana during the Carboniferous, actually reached their maximum height during the early Permian about 295 million years ago. And these mountains at the time were comparable in height to the Himalayas, but they became eroded progressively as the Permian went on. And the Cimmeria continent also at this time rifted away from Gondwana and drifted to the north to Laurasia, which caused the Paleotethys Ocean to actually get smaller and shrunk over time. And a new ocean growing on its southern end, the Neotethys Ocean, which would later become the Tethys Ocean that dominated much of the Mesozoic era, pretty much began to form late in the Permian. So, cool paleogeography stuff. Now, geologically speaking, there are a ton of depositional environments from the Permian, but it's a little bit of a weird time because the Permian has very, very abundant arid depositional environments. Now, keep in mind, arid does not necessarily mean hot and it doesn't necessarily mean desert. All it means is that you've got a very low amount of rainfall. After all, Antarctica is an arid desert, but it's not cold and it's not dominated by sand, or sorry, it's not hot and it's not dominated by sand or anything like that. It's just meets both those requirements due to making very little rainfall occurs there. So it's arid, it's not all desert, but generally the continental interiors are pretty dry. And we do see, however, that being said, a lot of desert depositional deposits, depositional systems known as Aeolian sandstones all over the Permian. They're very common. Because if you have a globe that's more or less not getting a whole lot of rainfall, you're going to have common deserts, even if all of it isn't a desert. However, there were some places where you had marine deposits. And a lot of these turned into very thick salt deposits because there wasn't a lot of precipitation or recharge by continental groundwaters or river waters. And so you would get a lot of these enclosed basins that were blocked off by reefs or sandbars, and they would just be exposed to the heat of, especially near the equator. And salt would precipitate out of the evaporating seawater and form these thick salt deposits. A lot of good ones are found in the Permian Basin in America. There's in the Southwest around Texas, you have this big basin that's chock full of salts. We're talking the Castile and the Salado formations are absolutely full of salts. They're hundreds of meters thick, which required over, fun fact, 65 kilometers worth of seawater total, like a depth of 65 kilometers over about a million years had to evaporate to make that salt. So that shows you how hot it was at the time, at least at the equator.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're gonna get this to a map later on, but was America like at the edge of the continent or the middle of the continent?
It was towards the edge, and I don't have a map, sorry, but it was
Oh.
closer towards the edge, but it made up again a substantial part of the interior as well. And it was close to the equator. So yeah, that's why it had a lot. We have a lot of evaporites in the North American continent compared to other places at the time. Now, the reason for all this aridity seems to have been the fact that as a supercontinent, you have massive continental interiors. These are big heat sinks, and they cause climates with massive seasonal variations of heat and cold. And most of your rain would tend, under those conditions, to come in monsoonal seasons. But even deserts experience monsoons, and monsoons don't necessarily dump high precipitation. They more of refer to constant precipitation. But if that constant precipitation is a very slow rate, you can have a monsoon season that doesn't dump a terrible amount of rainwater. So even in places where those evaporites were forming, you could have a somewhat ever-present rain, quote unquote, but not have a whole lot of precipitation
As soon
actually.
as it touched the ground, it was evaporated immediately, probably.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. But again, now aside from these evaporitic marine deposits, there are also standard marine deposits that are found from deeper ocean places. You have turbidites and other things. And then you have, in some places that were more temperate, you do see things like river floodplains and things of that sort. Which, fun fact, became a little bit more stable at this time because this was the time that we started having our first real trees show up, which I hope Jackson will talk about later. Now, the reason I had to stress that whole like arid doesn't equal hot is because actually compared to a lot of other geologic time periods, the Permian was fairly cool. It just had very low rainfall due to its continental arrangement. Um, and at the start of the Permian, the Earth was actually still in what is known as the late Paleozoic ice house. And this was essentially an ice age that started in the Devonian, carried through the Carboniferous, and ended in the Permian. And by 285 million years ago, temperatures had warmed, and the South Pole ice cap had retreated. But throughout the Permian, you still had glaciers present in upland areas of Australia, such as the Transantarctic Mountains and the mountainous regions of northern Siberia. And this picture right here, this is a glacial deposit from the Permian. Well, sorry, technically it's not a glacial deposit. It's older Paleozoic rocks. But you see all these patterns on it? Those are striations from a massive ice sheet moving across it. So this is an ancient fingerprint of an old glacier. And these are widespread in the Permian, which is how we know that an ice age continued into it. Because in most other periods where you don't have an ice age, they're very localized if they're preserved at all. And regarding Permian climate, it did change throughout the Permian. Again, you had the ice caps melting and retreating. And the end of the Permian was marked by a pretty prominent temperature excursion of about 5 degrees Celsius or so, which corresponds to the eruptions of the Siberian traps. That also corresponds to the Permian extinction, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Also, here are other Permian glacial striations from Australia. They're from Hallett Cove in Australia. So an ancient Permian ice sheet literally ground against these older Paleozoic rocks, and their fingerprint is still preserved for us to look at.
So how do we know these are from the Permian period, not the more recent ice age glacier things?
Stratigraphy, and we know that there was never ice sheets at this latitude.
All right.
So yeah, there was never ice at this latitude in Earth at the most recent ice age, and so the only thing that could cause it would have been an ancient ice sheet. Now, I mentioned earlier that it wasn't just one bad day for the Permian. There were a series of bad days because the Permian Triassic extinction, while it was the worst in Earth history, is not the only one the Permian experienced. The first one that we know the Permian experienced is actually called Olson's extinction.
Is that where the Mary Kate and Ashley got killed?
Maybe, I don't know. Anyways, Olson's extinction occurred about 273 million years ago in around the early Guadalupian epoch of the Permian period, and it predates, of course, the Permian Triassic extinction event. It was named after Everett C. Olson, who was an American geologist and paleontologist. Fun fact, he was also a zoologist. Um, and the first evidence of this extinction came when Olson noticed there was a hiatus between Permian faunas dominated by these guys, which were Pelycosaurs. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, Jackson. Please, or RJ, who's listening, please don't hit me. And Therapsids were lying above that hiatus. Therapsids were the most common sort of fauna in the middle and late Permian. And later on, it was recognized that it wasn't just a weird preservational thing with these guys. It was actually found to have a similar hiatus in marine invertebrates and other tetrapods and plants and pollen and a whole bunch of stuff, which indicated that we had a genuine extinction event on our hands. Again, yeah, Olson's Gap was the original name of it. They thought it was a preservational gap, but the later data showed that wasn't the case, and that actually came to light around the 90s and the early 2000s. And we don't really know what caused this. There is some research which indicates that climate change probably played a role. After all, if you look in like Kansas, in Permian deposits from Kansas, you do see chemical indicators of relatively extreme environments that had hot climates and acidic waters that were coincident with this extinction event. But whether this climate change was like a result of an Earth process that killed things off, or was a side effect of a different thing that caused the extinction, nobody knows. So we don't really know what caused this, but it was not a good time to be alive. And to make it worse, you had another bad day in the Permian, the Captanian extinction event, which occurred about 260 million years ago. And it's not so much like a hard punch pulse extinction event. It's more of a period of decreased diversity and an increase in extinction rates that occurred from about the middle Permian all the during like the entire last half of the Guadalupian epoch before the Captanian started. That next epoch started. That's when that occurred. And an estimate in 2016 suggested a loss of about 33 to 35% of marine genera. Just they all died at about this time. And in terms of terrestrial extinction rates, it regionally varied by a heavy amount. In southern Chinese rocks, it seems to have been about a 24% decrease across the board in terrestrial plants and animals. But in southern African rocks in the Karoo Basin, it's closer to a dip of about 80%. So there's a huge amount of regional variation as to how this extinction event affected the world. Unlike Olson's extinction event, we actually do have a good idea of what caused this. And it was probably caused by either one or a series of eruptions of the Emishian Traps volcanoes, which released a large amount of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere of both the northern and southern hemispheres at this time, which we know because they're huge. We know these are what did it, or we reasonably believe these are what did it because they've got massive flood basalt deposits at this time. And so these massive volcanic eruptions, again, dumping a lot of greenhouse gases, and they were located at the equator, so they would have contaminated the north and the south pretty much evenly. And these eruptions would have led to a sudden, quick global cooling event because of all the ash they're producing. But then once that ash settles out in a couple of years to decades, you're going to get longer term global warming, which explains the persistent decrease in species diversity over a longer time frame, which was expected of this.
Okay.
Um,
What
also,
was that?
these
Sorry.
yeah, sure.
I was
Go
say,
ahead.
you said the last one was the divine line between the cellbacks and the therapsids. Was this a divine line between any two kind of clades of creatures?
Nothing that stood out in my research. This was
Okay.
mostly this is mostly has its line drawn at microfossils.
Okay.
And it's more of a trend that like starts and then gets worse versus
Well,
like a hard dividing line. And that's the unfortunate thing, because this was not really something that was noticed during a pause in deposition, so you don't have a hard hiatus or unconformity here. You just have to go off what you've got in terms of microfossils and then see how it correlates to the rest of the world. Anyways, so these massive flood basalts would have led to global cooling and the short term, then long term global warming. They also would have dumped a lot of acidic chemicals into the oceans, caused the depletion of oxygen in the ocean, and had a severe disturbance of the biosphere overall. Wasn't a good time to be alive. And you think things would get better, but they didn't. You just not terribly long after, in geologic terms, you had another extinction event hit. You had the Permian Triassic extinction,
this
which
one does have
is
a good divine line.
yeah, this is very obvious on the rock record because of how sudden it was. This is like impossible to miss if you're studying rocks at these age, and it is the absolute worst extinction event the Earth has ever experienced. Upwards of 95% of marine species died off. Think about that. That's insane. And then 70% of all land genera just dead, dead in a very short time frame. It's not good. And it's also, for as durable and resilient as insects are, this is the one that we know caused a mass extinction of insects. We're not sure about the others, but this one, it was so bad it even affected them. And poor little trilobites, our little buddies, our little Cambrian buddies, which had been around for so long, that this was what finally did them in. And then
They survived like so many extinction events, but this thing.
yes, like two. They survived two previous ones, and now this is what finally makes them kick the bucket. Although weirdly, nautiloids, which today are very sensitive to temperature and chemical changes, they somehow found a way to survive. So how that worked, I don't know, but they did it. And this was such a bad extinction event that it took over 30 million years for the planet to recover. And leaving fossils out of it, just fun. I don't have it listed here, but fun fact. You see prior to this extinction event, a lot of slow, meandering river deposits, like over the terrestrial rocks of the Permian. And then this extinction hits. And then for about 30 million years, you see pretty much nothing but fast moving braided river systems leaving any sort of terrestrial rocks for that time period. And the reason is you only get meandering rivers when you have plants to slow things down. And immediately after this extinction, there was such little vegetation on the planet that we nearly reverted our river geology forming processes to like Precambrian times. It was really bad. And it even if you leave the fossils out of it, it's very blatant in the rocks. Like even if fossilization didn't exist, geologists would still be able to tell something really bad happened here because of the river deposits that were left behind. And yeah, here's a cute little illustration I found. Not a great time to live. A lot of sharks died off too. So, what might have caused the Permian Triassic extinction? Well, like with the previous one, we have a lot of evidence that magma from flood basalts, from the Siberian traps this time, poured out for several thousand years, caused immense environmental stresses, which caused the mass extinction. Um, for one, it would have significantly reduced coastal habitats because coastal areas are very sensitive to change in chemistry and sea level and things like that. And of course, giant giant volcanic eruptions are going to significantly impact like the salinity and the overall chemistry of the oceans. So coastal habitats are going to suffer first. Then we have to consider the amount of lava which we saw produced during this period. And the worst case scenario is that this would have raised the entire global temperature by about 5 degrees Celsius over several thousand years, which is a very high temperature rise over a very short time. Life doesn't adjust that quick to that sort of thing. But that being said, even though life would struggle with that, there's not a reason to think that a 5 degrees Celsius raise over only a few thousand years would kill 95% of most of the life on the planet. So there needs to be something else that's also making things a pain in the butt for life to deal with. And a good suggestion for this is that this warming would, of course, raise ocean temperatures. And on the bottom of the oceans, you have a lot of methane deposits slowly settle out, especially up in colder latitudes. And as the ocean melts, or sorry, as the ocean heats up, these methane reservoirs melt and they release methane into the ocean. Of course, that poisons the ocean. And also, from waves stirring up the surface and releasing gas into the atmosphere, dumps methane into the atmosphere, which on top of only a 5-degree rise in temperature, raises it another 5 degrees in temperature, which makes things even worse for everything that's living on the land. So essentially, you had a phase of terrestrial extinction from the initial expulsion of gas, and then you had and pollutants and things like that. Then you have the release of methane, killing off pretty much everything in the ocean. Then that methane gets released into the air through, like, going from the surface of the ocean into the atmosphere, and then heats up the Earth in a second pulse, which causes a second pulse of land-based extinction, which is exactly what we see in the fossil record.
So
And then
would this not
also,
have, I was gonna say, sorry, would this not have been so bad if the continents were together, weren't together, or would it matter or not? Would the continents be together, like, make it worse?
oh god, I would have to talk to someone about that. But if you want my speculation off the bat, I don't think it would have mattered, because I don't think there's much correlation between the continental arrangement and how much methane builds up on the seafloor. It mostly just
Okay.
depends on the latitude. So, like, maybe if you had a bunch of split up continents that were all near the equator, it would have been a little easier. But at least, like, if you took our current arrangement and had the same thing happen, probably wouldn't be much better, because we've got enough land mass up in the colder temperatures where methane likes to accumulate. Anyways, this frozen methane hypothesis also explains that we see a massive carbon-12 spike midway throughout this Permian-Triassic boundary layer. So, yeah, that's it. That's the Permian geology for you. It was not a time that you would really want to live in. It's not good.
No. So sad moment for everyone there.
Yeah, F,
But-
F in the chat.
Permian.
You're right. Yeah.
Beat you to it, Jackson.
Yep. True.
All right. Now, Jackson, what was for those lucky people living on the land today? What was their deal?
Well, let me tell you now. Let me show you how it goes. Oh, wait, hold on. Let's share the old screen. Oops, jumping ahead of myself. All right, can you see the old Jackson screen?
Yes.
All right, the Permian. In case you weren't already aware, this is the Permian. Alrighty, as Colton probably mentioned, I fell asleep. The Permian
Thank you.
began.
Hey, your screen disappeared.
Oh crap! Hold on. Hold up. Can you see it?
Not yet. I can't click it yet.
Share screen, window, share.
There again.
Okay. All right. As I was saying, well, the Permian both began and ended with a mass extinction event. Well, it started with an extinction event and ended with a mass extinction event, to be more precise. And the first one was
Based.
as we what?
I said based.
You're based.
Thank you.
Debased. I don't know. Anyway, the first one was the Permian. Sorry, was the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, which we discussed in our Carboniferous episode, in which the amphibians got knocked down a peg after they had enjoyed their day in the sun, but the world became much more dry and arid as opposed to the more tropical Carboniferous, and that led to the collapse of various rainforest ecosystems and the fragmentation of these rainforests. And so endemism was very common, and this paved the way for the amniotes, those who have amniotic eggs, to make their move.
Yeah, but why would it matter if you don't need to lay your eggs in the water to survive in this land? Why would that matter?
Why does it matter? Well, because the world is less humid now. It is less open for amphibians to move around because they still require humidity and closeness to water. Whereas if you're an amniote, you don't really need that. You can survive in much more arid climates. And so
You just gather your water from plants and then you put it in an egg.
exactly, and then off you hop. And so, as Colton already mentioned, we're still talking about Pangea. And it's a picture of some Dimetrodons. We'll talk about them shortly.
Thank you for the picture, though. You showed what I meant about that giant ocean that existed.
Oh yeah, the Panthalastic.
Hey,
there it is.
It's my thumbnail I found.
There you go. There you have it. All right, the Permian flora. Colton mentioned that I would mention it, and I am mentioning it now. So here we are, folks. We have come full circle. There's Oligocarpia up there in the top right. So it's a fern. Ferns have been around since the Devonian. The very first vascular plants like Cooksonia appeared in the Silurian, and the lycophytes and the ferns appeared like in the Devonian, and then they kind of took off. And we talked about the big lycophyte trees in the Carboniferous episode, like Lepidodendron, which are trees, but not like any trees we have today.
They weren't modern trees. That's why I specified.
Exactly. They're tree-ish. But and of course we have also gymnosperms, the early gymnosperms, which are the cone-bearing trees, which we also talked about during the Carboniferous episode, which is why I kind of omitted them here. Instead, we have these two guys called Glossopteris and Gigantopterus. So these are both interesting because they are early relatives of angiosperms, and this is kind of curious because the fossil record, there's a disconnect between the fossil record and the genetic record of flowers, of the flowering plants, which are collectively called the angiosperms. So the earliest true angiosperms, which are which are like the magnoliids, the eudicots, the monocots, and a couple other little primitive groups, just sort of appear in the early Cretaceous, and there's circumstantial evidence that they were probably originating in the late Jurassic, which is probably what drove in part the radiation of dinosaurs, and then finally the early Cretaceous terrestrial revolution. So it's probably some good circumstantial evidence for them having appeared shortly beforehand. But we don't find sort of proto-flowers, if that makes sense. You find like Archifructus, Cycarpus, and a couple others, which are also in the early Cretaceous. and you find the early eudicots. So you find early derived flowers at kind of the very start. But there are no sort of like half flowers. There's no tiktaalik of angiosperms, at least that we've discovered yet. There may be out there, maybe in some fossil deposit that just hasn't been investigated yet. Who knows?
So is this like the beginning
Aren't
of the?
these things called Darwin's abominable mystery or something?
Yeah, so the genetics of like where flowers come from has been largely worked out. I mean, if you look at a flower, I don't have a picture here, but everything, all the parts of flowers are just leaves. Like the petals are just leaves, the sepals, the carpels, the stamen, everything. It's all just highly, highly modified leaves. So like petals are leaves modified to attract insects or birds or whatever. The the gynecium is where you have, which is the female part. So you have the eggs. So it's basically a leaf that they took and sort of folded. And if you look at the very primitive flowers like Ambarella, the folding happens and it's like there's like the sticky secretion on one side. But if you look at the higher flowers like monocots, eudicots, magnoliids, it's totally sealed. The tissue actually fuses, so it is a total fusion. Same for the androecium, which is where the pollen comes from, and that's also just modified, again, highly modified leaves. If you look at like the basal flowers, like what is it, Ostrobayales, however you pronounce it. It's like you have like a leaf, and then you have these little stripes, which are the pollen. This is where the pollen is produced. And then if you look at magnoliids, those leaves are still there, but they're sort of reduced in size. And then if you look at the higher flowers, you just have this long leaf, essentially, which is the androecium, which has the pollen concentrated at the top. So
So
very
is this
highly
like the
derived.
start of the pines and stuff, that family?
Well, the pine specifically, I'm not sure. The Pinaceae, but the group containing them, the gymnosperms,
Yeah.
had been around since the Carboniferous.
Okay.
We see the very first ones appearing sort of at the end of the Devonian, into the Carboniferous, and so somewhere, probably in the Devonian, the gymnosperms and angiosperm ancestors split, and we see these very early angiosperm relatives who obviously don't have flowers, but they have some features in common which link them with the angiosperms. But you sort of have these early guys, and then you have basically the full flowers. So we're kind of missing the intermediate step right now, which would have appeared which would have been in like the Permian, the Triassic, or the Jurassic. Those intermediate, the tiktaalik of flowers would be somewhere in that area.
But
We just
these are
haven't found it
still
yet.
mainly wind pollination things.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, probably. Most things were wind pollinated at that time. You get like a radiation of insects in the Triassic with the Mesozoic lacustrine revolution and stuff like that. So yeah, you'll see them more later.
Uh,
All right. Amphibians. So, of course, amphibians weren't gone. They're still around today. So here's a couple of forms that were very weird. You have Diplocaulus, which is that guy in the top left, that triangular head. So it was aquatic. Peltobatrachus. Now on the bottom left, he had sort of armor plating on his back. Baggyherpeton in the top right. So kind of like a crocodile would have lived very similar to one, that sort of convergent niche. And then Platyhystrix, I like him. He's really cool because he looks like a Dimetrodon, like a little bitty Dimetrodon, but he's actually an amphibian. So that sail probably for thermoregulation evolved in a bunch of different groups of amniotes. So we're all familiar with Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus having these, and they're of course our early relatives, early synapsids. Amphibians also evolved. There's some amphibians evolved as sail, like Platyhystrix. some crocodilians, pseudotsuchians to be more precise, crocodile relatives, evolved sails like Arizonosaurus, Spinosaurus, and Ouranosaurus evolved sails. So having a sail to regulate your body temperature is very, very useful, especially when you're probably living in an arid and possibly a hot arid environment, and so these have been very useful.
So amphibians were probably as big as they were during the last period. They were probably had been done a little bit.
Yeah, their diversity had definitely been curtailed as a result of the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, and then it will be even more so at the end as a result of the Permian Triassic mass extinction. And today we just have 3 groups of amphibians. We have the frogs and toads, the salamanders, and caecilians, and that's it. This huge diversity, which involve like these crocodile like guys, the reptiliomorphs, all those sorts of things, they've all gone extinct. They're all long gone. We have extremely, and sadly, lots of amphibians today are endangered because they don't adapt well to a lot of environmental stressors. So, not great. Okay, so let's flip on over to a group called the parareptiles. So these are also called the anapsids, but there's a little bit of a difficulty with that term anapsida, which we discussed in the Carboniferous video. The problem is, originally, the classification, the traditional classification of reptiles was putting them in one of 3 groups. One is the anapsids, having 0 temporal fenestra. They were considered the most primitive. The synapsids, which have 1, those are the mammals and the so-called mammal-like reptiles, or reptile-like mammals. And then finally the diapsids, which have the 2 holes in the skull, and that includes the lepidosaurs, which are the snakes and lizards, and then the archosaurs, which, Colton, yes, you did pronounce it correctly.
Sweet.
Like the crocodiles and birds and the dinosaurs, of course. So it turns out, anapsida, if you look at more recent, phylogenies, like there was one that came out I think it was earlier this year, puts parareptiles as sister to diapsids, and within a group of, or it's like the parareptiles nest within diapsida, basically. So they're not as different as they previously were thought. But also this group, the parareptiles, was thought to include the turtles, or the anapsids were thought to include the turtles, because turtles have no temporal fenestra. Turns out that's wrong. Turtles are so highly modified. They are, in fact, diapsids, but they nest. They are sister to the clade containing the crocodilians and the birds. So they're sister to the archosaurs. And this group is so highly modified, they've actually independently closed their 2 temporal fenestra. And if you look at early turtle relatives like Unodontosaurus, you can see that that they still had their 2 temporal fenestra back then, and they just became closed over time. Now the parareptiles, I believe you sort of see them first appear, I believe it's the end Carboniferous, and then they survive into like the Triassic, and then that's it. They don't survive the end Triassic extinction event. So here's a couple of them. Top left is Milleretta, so a small lizard-like guy. Bottom left is Periosaurus. So the Periosaurs were kind of a cool group. They and the Procholophonoids, which includes that little guy on the bottom right, Procholophan. Either the Periosaurs or the Procholophonoids were considered to be like the ancestors of turtles, because they both have very broadened ribs. Well, that was one of the features. But of course, neither of them are the ancestors of turtles. Turtles are a completely separate group. Mesosaurus is cool. Colton, you may have heard of Mesosaurus before.
Just a little bit.
Was that one of the things that you mentioned in our Return to the Water episode a few months ago?
Actually, yeah, probably. But Mesosaurus is known in geological circles for a different reason. Do you know what it was, Colton?
No, I wouldn't actually.
Pangea. So
Really?
Alfred Wegener used, or one of the fossils Alfred Wegener used was the distribution of Mesosaurus across the continents to
Oh yeah.
along with like a couple ferns,
Yeah, I remember. I
Listrosaurus.
remember him for the ferns.
Yeah, yeah. Oh dang, I'm drawing a blank. Was it? Oh man, I can't believe I can't remember the name. Anyway,
So this is the guy that helped verify the plate tectonics thing.
yes, yep, that's
More of who
Mesosaurus.
came up with plate tectonics.
Yep, he helped because Alfred Wegener saw that there were distributions of these different fossils like Mesosaurus and Listrosaurus. Glossopterus, that's what it was. That was the fern, Glossopterus. And he saw, hey, they're in South America, Africa. That's weird. Wonder why that is. And so that was part of the data that helped put us on that track. Neodiapsida. Okay, so so the diapsids which are sister to the parareptiles are called the neodiapsids. You have basically the very primitive diapsids, and then you have parareptiles and the neodiapsids sister to each other. And so here you have a little smattering of them. You have Youngina or Youngina, however you pronounce that. Another little lizard-like guy, Hovosaurus and Thaddeosaurus, which both may have been aquatic or at least partially aquatic, interestingly enough. And then down there in the bottom left is Coelurosaurus, which is a little gliding reptile, very curiously. So there were so the gliding ability of certain lizards has been independently achieved more than once. He's a weird little guy.
And if this wasn't a different branch of the family tree, you would almost think that the Havosaurus was more of a transition of the last one on this side of the branch. It was like
the which one?
The Moses thing, Moses sort. The one on the right, the top right on the last slide. They look almost similar, but with like more
the Mesosaur?
Yeah, like more of they look almost similar, but more of a web feet behind the feet on this one.
Oh yeah, it's just similar niches. They both need web feet for paddling. Okay, so and then of course
our branch.
Yep, our branch, the synapsids. Woo. So, as I said, the guys with one hole in their skull, they're all just kind of out of order. Oh well. Anyway, Edaphosaurus, that guy in the bottom left. So he is an early, or she, no judgment here, is an early synapsid, and so that the early synapsids, a lot of them had these fans for thermoregulation. So probably that's what helped put us on the path towards endothermy as opposed to the other amniotes.
Luckily, you need a sunbathe for a half an hour before you get to work.
Yeah,
nowadays.
Exactly. That would suck. Estiminosuchus and Gorgonops. So we're getting down towards the like the therapsids, or the Gorgonops are definitely therapsids. Estiminosuchus I picked because it has just absolutely wild facial structures, which, was it for protection? Was it for sexual selection, or maybe both? Who knows? Possibly.
So is that more? I know the Gorgonopus looks like meat eaters, but was that a meat or plant guy?
I don't remember. Could be either. In all honesty, could be omnivorous. And then Dicynodon. So, the Cynodonts and Dicynodonts survived into the Triassic. The Cynodonts includes us. we are descendants of the cynodonts. The dicynodonts, though, they only made it into the Triassic and then were wiped out by the Triassic Jurassic extinction event.
The die means that they're dead.
Well, not exactly.
Just kidding.
But it could, I guess. And so they didn't make it out. They probably made little holes and things like that. They probably lived like kind of like shrews or moles, like eating insects or eating arthropods and things like that. And so here's a picture. Here we go. Okay. So as you can see, these guys who had these sails are paraphyletic to the rest of the synapsids. So the earliest synapsids, like the casiosaurs, they're very reptile-like, not very mammal-like at all. Interestingly,
you can make that picture a little bit bigger because that a little hard to see some of the bottom ones.
I don't think so.
Okay.
All
right.
Is it better now?
Yeah, that's okay. I can zoom in, I guess.
It is kind of a light picture. It's like a pencil sketch. It looks like. Interestingly, the second from the top guy is it says Verinopidae. So they've actually been moved from the synapsids to the diapsids because nothing says transitional fossil like being hard to place between two different groups, right? So yeah, they got moved. The Ophiachodontids, it includes some large predators. Then Edaphosaurids, Phenacodontids, so Edaphosaurs and guys like Dimetrodon. Dinocephalians, I believe that includes the Estiminasuchus. Gorgonoptions, so you're in like the Therapsids, so you're getting progressively more mammal-like. Hair is known from like remains of early Therapsids, so we know hair was way back there. The question is, did hair evolve from whiskers or did whiskers evolve from hair? And there's a debate over that right now, interestingly, because hair does not fossilize super well, and especially that far back. And so still debate about that. But the really important thing with the evolution of synapsids was their jaw, which RJ and I discuss at length in Evolution Slam Dunk and The Rocks Were There, respectively. And so you can see the change in articulation from the quadrate articular joint only, and then you go to both the quadrate articular and the dentary squamosal joints, and then slowly you reduce the quadrate articular joint until the only thing that's left is the dentary squamosal joint. And so it's really cool. In fact, the fossils like Probanignathus were predicted in advance by paleontologists, I think it was Robert Broom. He said, "Look, if mammals are descended from reptiles, quote quote, then they should have gone through this transformation." And lo and behold, there it is, just like it was predicted. So, yay for evolution. Okay. And then, of course, as Coltonia hath already mentioned, the Permian extinction just cleared the deck of a ludicrous number of species. It is quite difficult to fathom the amount of biodiversity that was lost as a result of the Permian Triassic mass extinction. So a couple of things here. If you look at the bottom left, that's Lystrosaurus. So that's also one of the fossils that helped Alfred Wegener figure out plate tectonics, but also, so yeah, it's one of the most abundant animals across the Permian Triassic boundary. In fact, in some localities, it makes up 90% of the fossils. They were incredibly prolific. So much so that Anthony Martin, in his book, oh dang, what is it? The Evolution Underground. He actually wrote like a whole fan fiction story about a couple of Lystosauruses surviving the Permian mass extinction. It's very funny. At least I thought it was very funny.
Are they like eating trees there?
Yeah, those are some kind of plant. It's very low trees, so because they're only like a couple of feet tall, so those trees aren't more than a few feet tall.
Okay.
And then this picture on the right, Colton said that the Permian mass extinction killed off a lot of sharks, and while that may be true, this is not a shark. Colton.
Yes, rub it in my face that the guy who barely knows what a mitochondria is doesn't know terribly much about biology.
Hey, what is the mitochondria? It's
the thing that makes a plant go.
The
Tell me I'm wrong, Jackson, because I know that's technically true.
I mean, I can't argue with that. I can't argue with it, but that's not the answer I was looking for.
The powerhouse of the cell, yeah, I know.
This guy is called Squalocorax, or at least one of them. It looks like a shark, but it's a chimera. So it's a member of the clade Holocephali, not Salaki, or Salakii, however you pronounce it. But it does look like a shark. But he's got this wild that bottom jaw, like the teeth aren't out to the side. They're like straight on, because he forms a tooth whorl. It's bonkers. Just look at that. Can you imagine like all of your teeth in a row on your bottom jaw? It's horrifying. It's like a buzzsaw.
So which animals, which clade animals would that be more related to? The sharks, the rayfish, the lobefin fishes?
Like I just said, it's the chimeras.
Oh, okay.
So within the cartilaginous fish, the chondrichthyans, you have three clades. You have Batoidea, which are the skates and rays, Salakii, which are the sharks, and then Holocephali, which are the chimeras, or what they called chimeras and ratfish is the other name for them. And so that belongs to the Holocephali, or Holocephali. Not entirely sure how to pronounce it. I don't speak Latin. So there you go. There you have it, folks. The critters of the Permian.
Thank you for that. Now, Colton mentioned the ocean thing. Do you know why the more cell, Jackson? Do you know why the more cell back synapsids died off before that, and it was more of a therapsids after that?
Well, I mean, it's a grade. These guys were the newest synapsids on the block. They were big predators and herbivores, and some of their lineages diversified further, and then outcompeted them, and they went extinct, and some more lineages came, and then they got outcompeted, and et cetera, et cetera.
All right. Now, for our friend Brainbug here, do you know what's happening with the bugs, the arthropods, and the insects of this time period?
So we're still dealing with a lot of the big arthropods that were in the Carboniferous. A number of them are still around in the Permian. They didn't like all just die off. Some of them, like Arthropleura, were still in the Permian. I don't know about other big guys like Meganeura, but I do remember reading about Arthropleura. Because oxygen levels were still very high in the Permian. Like they went up in the Carboniferous, and they stayed pretty high throughout the Permian, and then they kind of drop off in the Triassic. So you would still have had these large arthropods.
Colton also mentioned from the Devonian to the end, the beginning of the Permian, it was still very, very cold and stuff. Was there any do we know if there's any I can't tell. I guess we can't tell the color of fossils. Maybe we can. But are there any polar animals in this time period? polar-like animals?
I doubt it. Unless like fish, maybe, because fish have evolved lots of different ways of mitigating like cold stress, um but like terrestrial critters, probably not. Feathers weren't a thing yet. Fur was not a thing yet. Basically, no integumentary structures that could provide you any sort of warmth were around yet. So I would probably say not. But it was an ice house period, wasn't it? So that means there were
Yeah.
polar caps, right?
Yeah, there were polar caps, there were glaciers. It was
Yeah.
there was a small Permian ice age that immediately succeeded the Carboniferous one that was big. But it was more of an ending than anything else.
Okay.
Also, for question for Erica, that was there any, I know they weren't actually primates in this time period, but were there any like tree dwelling creatures?
Oh yeah. Actually, well, was it Triassic? There's a guy called Megalanchosaurus, I think. I was that. I can't actually. Hold on. Was that? Let me see if that was Triassic or Permian. Nope, it was Triassic.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean there were various reptiles, some of whom were almost undoubtedly living in trees. Because just living in trees is nice if you're small, because large predators can't scurry up trees after you. So yeah.
Yeah, we mentioned the trip from synapsids to the therapsids, the Cydons, the mammals.
Mm-hmm.
What about the line that eventually led to dinosaurs, the Archosaurus line? How were they doing?
So diapsids were around, or the neodiapsids were around, but they were playing a relatively minor role in most ecologies, at least from what I've seen, or in most Permian ecologies. So they're small, which again we expect because the earliest dinosaur forms and the earliest pseudoseuchians were relatively small. So these guys are fairly small. There were some large early archosaurs. Like there was this really big one called Teleocrator, which was like a quadruped. It was just huge. But most of them were relatively small because you have these smaller lizard-like guys, like I think Lagerpaton and Marasuchus, and was it Hesperasuchus, I think. And they're all fairly little, and they're going to be the progenitors of the big groups, like the pterosaurs in the case of Lagerpaton, or the dinosaurs, So, but yeah, they're still relatively small at that point.
So was the Permian, summertime the Permian, was that where the Archosaurs and the Leptosaurs split? That I'm pronouncing it right?
Yeah. The Permian is probably when Lepetosaurs and Archosaurs split. Somewhere in that time.
Hey, Vandalia, it's really late for me. I gotta get out of here. But Jackson, lovely presentation. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you for being here again. Thank you for staying up so late.
No problem. Anything for Jackie Poo. All right, I'll see you guys.
See you later.
Now I know the what was later on. I know the mosasaurs came from the Leptosaurus side of the family, but future on. But where did like the Ichthyosaurs and the Plesiosaurs branch off? Was that the neodiapsids or somewhere between? Or
yeah, so those neodiapsids. There's a bit of debate as to where exactly they fall. They're members of a group called the Sauropterygia. There have been some papers, and I'm not sure of their validity, but there have been some who argued that Sauropterygia actually includes the turtles. So if that is the case, that means that Sauropterygians are not distant from the Archosaurs. They're relatively close to each other.
All right. So, all right. The chat now. The chat. Anybody in the chat? I know 6 of you are watching right now, and you have any questions for Jackson here? too late for Colton. Sorry, you missed your chance there. But any questions for Jackson about this time period? Oh, we're waiting. Oh, while we're waiting, Jackson, do you have any favorite creatures of this time period?
Well, like I showed, Esteminasuchus is pretty cool, I think, because its head ornamentation is pretty wild. Other than that, not really. I think Diplocaulus is kind of a weird amphibian with that super triangle head.
Yeah, well, like I said, while I was researching for this, when I was doing my little small research for this thing, like I did not know. I knew about the in Permian, but I did not know about the little two minor extinction events in here. No one ever talked about them. The ocean and the ocean and the Caspian. I haven't even heard those before until like last few months.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing research for this. Did you learn anything new on your researching this, or did you know most of the stuff already?
I knew most of this stuff already.
So nothing new. You discovered. Oh, I did not know that before.
Not really. This was really more of a culling of the information that I was already familiar with.
The in Permian was that where I think it's was that where the Rayfin fish took over? Right, the Rafe side fish took over, or they already dominated the ocean by that point?
They had a major radiation in the Triassic.
Okay.
I mean, they're around. They're out there, but they're
okay. So probably maybe the lobefin fishes were still dominating till this point. Then maybe.
Yeah, I think they're even still. I think they're probably even we're still like placoderms around at this time. Not entirely positive on that, but yeah, lobefin fish. There's still pretty good diversity of like lobefin fish, and of course chondrichthyans, and so then your teleosts had a diversification of it in the Triassic. But anyways, are there any questions from the audience?
Anybody?
Because if not, I think we could wrap it.
All right. Last call for questions. If not now, just I guess you type it in the comment section below.
You'll have to wait till we do another chat.
Yep. For a totally different topic.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, I guess. Well, I don't talking about upcoming events. Anything upcoming on your channel? Besides, go on.
I will be making a guest appearance on somebody else's channel in the near future, and I'm excited for that. Continuing with the Ancestor's Tale.
Are we finally at the point where we're not human ancestors anymore?
Yes, we are finally there. The next video is the very first outside of the hominins, and I mean we're what 8 videos in, something like that. It's been a while, so yeah, we're finally there, finally out.
For me, next week we're going away from history and science. We're going to be more philosophizing next episode, and also sometime in January maybe Jackson will be back to talk about our most distant cousins that can still be considered a mammal.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, the marsupials, or not marsupials, the monotremes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Our egg-laying cousins.
Right. Yep. The monotremes, monotremata.
All right. And with that, Jackson, say your line.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
And never stop learning. Enjoy the randomness. We'll see you next week.